So I just want to speak fairly briefly about the criminalisation of youth, which will provide us with an intersection of some of the areas that you've already considered and, just add, a different layer to that understanding. Okay, so a major problem for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people is that their daily interactions are mainly with state bodies, such as police, state schools, and other public authorities. What that means in practice is that Aboriginal lives are often quite heavily catalogued. And, for these young kids, in terms of discretions against what's called, public order, so potential behaviours in schools, but also the demonising of Aboriginal families often means that Aboriginal kids are much more likely to be under the surveillance of the nation state. It seems absolutely incredible, for instance, that it's taken until 2020 for the law to catch up and recognise the traditional family structures and practices of Torres Strait Islanders. It seems incredible that we're in a situation where more kids are being removed from their families than at the height of the term of the stolen generations. It seems incredible for us to say that in the Northern Territory, most often the juvenile justice population is 100% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. These kind of statistics are absolutely mind-blowing. I've used the picture here of a protest in Newcastle about the Don Dale facility after the ABC expose, and I want to discuss that a little bit more in the lecture. But I also want to, just talk generally about how when we place any group under heavy surveillance, the rates of offence are going to be higher because people are seeing and reporting behaviours in ways that don't happen in more affluent suburbs. And let's be honest, often in suburbs which don't have high Indigenous populations. So we need, I think, to be really mindful of these things. In the next section of the lecture, I want to talk about comments that have been made by the Special Rapporteur, which is a particular position within the United Nations concerned with, various elements of human rights. But I want you to think about what the rapporteurs are talking about in terms of its impact on youth incarceration. So if we think about criticisms that came about the Northern Territory intervention, we can see that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children's lives suddenly had an enormous increase in both the police and the army into their communities. What they also did, was bring in, a whole raft of medical professionals to examine, for instance, whether children had been sexually abused and to really scrutinise Aboriginal families. So in many of these communities, that over-policing becomes the norm that people are living with. And that creates, depressions. It creates its own series of behaviours that supposedly it's actually seeking to address. Okay, so one of the things we know from sociologists and criminologists who have very carefully studied the data is that an Indigenous young person is more likely than a non-Indigenous offender to be arrested, charged, taken to court, and given bail conditions. Non-Indigenous offenders were more likely to be let go with a warning or a caution and no arrest, or without bail conditions if they were arrested and charged. And, this is something which has been consistent over many decades. Okay. When we think about how that then flows on, we can see that Indigenous young people were 24 times as likely as non-Indigenous people to be in youth detention. And over 53% of all young people in detention were Indigenous. When we consider that, the Indigenous population makes up, under 5% of the broader Australian population, that's absolutely outrageous. And a lot of people would suggest that that is the failure of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and not a structural issue. Well, the fact that we can see that there are very clear differences in how offenders are treated based on race is one thing that we can throw into the mix. But what we can also see is that Indigenous peoples across the world who have experienced colonisation often have statistics and experiences which mirror these particular examples. So that also, I think if we're looking through our sociological lens, tells us about the potential for that to be structural rather than about individual cultures. And in fact, that's what you will find the vast majority of sociologists will suggest. Okay, that there are definite structural inequalities, inequities, and discriminatory practices that impact directly on Indigenous youth and on Indigenous peoples more broadly. Okay, one of the things that we can see really clearly that has been part of Australia since colonisation is a major difference in what's considered, I guess, legitimate reasons for gathering, and also the difference in public and private space. So we know that Indigenous young people can often be found, in groups in parks and other outdoor areas. We know that that's also true of Aboriginal adults. Once people are in those public spaces, there's a much higher level of surveillance. So we can see that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal youth even use outdoor space in different ways. So non-Indigenous people are more likely to congregate, for instance, in parks and other outdoor areas. And what's really interesting about that is that it costs money to build that infrastructure, but there's less money in just simply maintaining a park. Okay, so we know then that, if there are groups of Indigenous youth who are gathered, they're more likely to be reported as suspicious. We know that things like police drive-bys increase. And so we know then that, possible behaviours that can bring them to the attention of police, like smoking or drinking, we can see in a lot of areas where either Indigenous or non-Indigenous youth gather that there's an increase in things like graffiti. When you're being surveilled at a much higher rate, you're going to be caught. What we also know is that, and I want to talk about this a little bit later, is that police often maintain a register of young people, and that is predominantly directed towards youth who are marginalised, including Indigenous youth. I had a really interesting tutorial once when I was working in humanities and social science, where a woman talked about an incident that had occurred in the mall at the malled area at Charlestown. And she said she'd gone there on the weekend with her young daughter, and they'd had to cross to the other side of the mall because there was an Aboriginal man sleeping on one of the benches. And I mean, I didn't even have to say anything. Other students started questioning her, and they said, well, why did you have to go to the other side of the mall? And she said, oh, well, I didn't want her to see that. And they said, you didn't want her to see a man sleeping on a bench? And she said, well, he might have woken up. So then they said, so you didn't want her to see a man sitting on a bench? And she said, well, you don't know what could have happened. Now, the fact that she'd identified him as an Aboriginal man, it means that, she had a series of stereotyped beliefs. And so she was talking, more in depth to try and get us into her mindset to understand how he had been sleeping on the park bench. And one of the students, so when I say that higher rates of surveillance exist, this is not just my personal opinion. When I also say that it leads young people into negative interactions with police, this is also not simply my opinion. So in New South Wales, there's a program called the Suspect Targeting Management Plan. Okay. And earlier this year, the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission found that Aboriginal people constitute 72% of young people who are subject to a suspect target management plan. Okay? And that what happened then with that was that police conducted ongoing and repeating stops, searches, or visits to the young person's home. Okay? Now, this is a list which has been going for 20 years. Okay, 2 whole decades. Okay, so this is not something that is new. This, has basically been in place for as long as I've been an adult. All right. So what it was found in this report was that they use tactics which are, quote, unreasonable, unjust, and oppressive, and in some cases, potentially illegal. What happens with the way that it's enforced is that, again, let's look at the findings. That they were, quote, intrusive, that the surveillance was unreasonable, and that in some cases this could constitute harassment. So they reviewed the cases of 429 children who were aged between 9 and 17 and were placed on the plan in the 2 years between 2016 and 2018. What is marked about this process is that the targets are disproportionately Indigenous. And sometimes Indigenous children were placed on the list despite never having been charged with an offence, including a 9-year-old boy from rural New South Wales who had been identified by police as a victim of domestic violence. So what this does, instead of making, for instance, that young man see the police as a place of, the police are there to protect us. This is a place of safety. Instead, what we see is that it actually re-victimizes many young people. Okay, so it uses these different kind of algorithms. Okay, and yet representatives from the Aboriginal Legal Service said it was hard not to draw the conclusion that the program was discriminatory and that really it shouldn't be used to target children at all. So Nadine Miles from the New South Wales Aboriginal Legal Service said, "Our position is that the overwhelming detriment to individuals, communities and family units subject to this program outweighs the need for police to use such tactics when it comes to young children. We've got examples where families have been torn apart because of these tactics. We've seen children made to reside with other people and to stop the harm being caused in family units. It's just not on, and it's appalling." What happens when you're on that list is that young people are 4 times more likely to be subject to stop, search and detain tactics compared with, other positive strategies like a local, referral to a local PCYC. So in this, it's all purely about targeting that person. It's purely about monitoring and surveillance. There's nothing, positive that kind of goes with it. And it's argued that it's both intrusive and destructive to young people's day-to-day lives. And it certainly doesn't appear to be a useful diversionary tactic. And it's argued that it could actually serve to increase the likelihood that a young person or child will be charged and therefore drawn into the criminal justice system. So let's look at one particular example. A young person between November 2015 and March 2017 was subjected to 195 home visits, while another home was visited 10 times in a month, including once at 3 a.m. And this, I think, creates an environment of just such absolute terror for these young people that we really, need to be incredibly concerned about their mental health, to be under, that total unknowing terror of when they're going to be surveilled. And that, certainly isn't being taken into account. Okay, so as this sign indicates, Aboriginal people, on some indicators, are the most incarcerated people on earth. What that tells me is that as a society, we have, an absolutely urgent need to address the inequalities that exist within our society, to challenge those stereotypes which exist, going right back to their historical roots, and, really critiquing what they're saying. We need to think about the ways that, individually, the ways that we speak, the stereotypes that we might pass on, transform, support, and empower a much greater level of institutional disadvantage. Okay, doing courses like sociology, being in the area of the humanities, the social science, in areas of health, in fact, in every area that you might study across the tertiary sector, there is a role for you, whether as an individual or as part of a broader system, to speak up against, to challenge and to not accept racism against anyone. Okay? Let me say though specifically that if you have a particular part of the population which is being disproportionately affected, then it becomes critical to put that population as a very specific focus. And it's for that reason that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people support what's termed the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, in contrast, people have said all lives matter. Of course, all lives matter, but all lives are not being affected in the same ways. Sociology allows us that lens to see who is being disadvantaged, and it provides us with the tools but also the responsibility to address disadvantage where we see it.